State and federal agents had already raided Ali's daycare center in South Minneapolis.
We learned today that the local Somali community says it's dealing with backlash from that investigation.
For needy children allegedly stolen from Minnesota taxpayers instead.
For over $1 million worth of bogus child care services.
At 6:15 inches the morning, the air in St. Paul, Minnesota remained gripped by a bone-chilling freeze. The streets of the Southern District were deserted, marked only by the thick exhaust clouds of 3 unidentified federal SUVs idling at the curb. Packed inside those cabs were 11 federal investigators from the FBI and the Department of Health and Human Services. They weren't arriving for a narcotics raid. They weren't there to corner a fugitive. On the books, this was a simple compliance audit of a state-certified childcare facility. The operation was headed by Amina Farah Hassan, a 45-year-old director whose professional record was spotless. According to state data, she oversaw 5 different daycare sites across the Twin Cities. Her documentation claims she provided care for over 780 children daily. Because of these massive enrollment figures, government subsidies flowed in punctually, quietly, and without fail. Over a 4-year window, the total capital funneled into her organization surpassed $2.5 billion. But as the agents exited their vehicles and moved toward the entrance, the facility was ghost quiet. There were no parents dropping off toddlers. There was no commotion. The windows were hollow and dark. The lead investigator turned the key and pushed inside. The interior air was heavy and stagnant. The environment felt instinctively wrong. Toys were lined up on the shelves in surgical rows, coated in a fine, undisturbed shroud of dust. Cribs were fully put together in the nursery, but the sheets were crisp. They had never held a sleeping child. Attendance logs were pinned to the wall, meticulously filled out in blue ink. Every checkbox was ticked. Every identity was logged. Yet, the room itself had no soul. This single branch had pulled in over $42 million in public subsidies over the previous 12 months. Yet, there was zero physical proof that a single child had ever spent a full afternoon there. Inside the director's private office, the search team uncovered the mechanism of the fraud. Resting on the desk was a massive binder containing a fabricated roster of over 700 minors. As investigators scanned the pages, they grasped the complexity of the plot. These weren't just made-up names. The ring had built synthetic identities. They harvested legitimate social security numbers sourced from the dark web, pairing them with forged birth certificates produced in a clandestine print shop. They had mobilized an army of ghost children who existed only within the state's digital payment architecture.
To a fraud scheme that totaled $250 million for funding that was for a nonprofit that was supposed to help hungry children.
But the true grim reality was locked inside the steel safe bolted to the floorboards. When the forensic locksmith breached the door, they found more than just ledgers. They discovered $35 million in raw cash, vacuum-sealed in heavy black plastic. Resting atop the currency were 5 dense bricks, marked with a distinct emblem, the scorpion insignia of the CJNG cartel. At that moment, the task force realized this wasn't mere welfare grifting. This wasn't just a low-level skim. This was a high-volume money laundering terminal for a global criminal syndicate. Amina Farah Hassan wasn't running a nursery. She was operating a private bank for the cartel, subsidized entirely by the American taxpayer. Welcome back. What you are observing is the dismantling of the Ghost Child Network, a fraud operation so colossal it managed to bleed billions from the U.S. government while standing in plain view. The routine audit had transformed into a major crime scene. By mid-morning, federal forensic accountants began scraping the deep data tied to the network's licensing codes. What they surfaced defied all logic. The records indicated that Zamir Abdi Hassan, a relative serving as co-director, was supposedly managing several sites at the exact same time. Birth dates for the children were mirrored.
The latest allegations add to a growing list of fraud investigations in Minnesota. So far, 92 people have been charged, including 82 Somali Americans.
Residential addresses were cloned across multiple municipalities. Yet, from 2021 to 2025, the total payouts to the network reached the billions. In peak months, deposits spiked over $74 million. The wealth was funneled through 43 shell accounts before being dispersed. Less than 4% of the capital could be linked to actual business costs like food, lease payments, or staffing. There were no catering invoices, no facility upkeep. Instead, the data painted a darker picture. Funds were wired overseas in strategic bursts. Each transaction was kept just below the federal oversight threshold. $2.5 billion was moved in less than 4 years through accounts that never cut a single paycheck to a real employee. The money was migrating to East Africa, the Middle East, and front companies in Mexico. This cell survived not because it was invisible. It survived because it mimicked normalcy.
Some 78 people that were charged, 72 of them were from Somalia.
Behind the pristine paperwork was a financial engine draining the public dry. But how did they deceive the neighbors? How did they bypass the oversight boards for so long? The probe discovered that the network had choreographed elaborate theater operations. They retrieved a file on Amina's hard drive titled Simulation Shifts. It outlined a schedule for hired actors to cycle cars through the parking lot during peak hours to simulate traffic. They even went as far as installing outdoor speakers camouflaged in the landscaping that played looped audio of children's laughter and playground noise throughout the day. They kept a stockpile of used car seats that were rotated between vehicles to give the parents an air of legitimacy. It was a high-budget production staged for an audience of one, the state inspector. But the task force needed to track the final destination of the wealth. The digital wires led to offshore banks, but the physical currency in the safe pointed to a local heart. That is when the feds used their most effective tool. They stopped following the money and started following the utilities. Analysts scrutinized the electricity and water consumption for every site tied to the shell entities. One location hit the red. An abandoned industrial warehouse 30 miles outside the city was burning through 85,000 gallons of water every day. The discovery of that utility spike redirected the entire hunt. The ghost daycare in the city was merely the front office. The industrial site 30 miles outside St. Paul was the furnace. On paper, the lot was an empty manufacturing plant. It had filed no taxes for 3 years. There were no business permits linked to the site. Yet, the water utility data showed it was consuming 85,000 gallons of water daily, enough to sustain a small town. Federal experts knew that dead buildings don't drink water, and they certainly don't draw massive power loads between 2 and 4 inches the morning. By nightfall, the case had shifted from a paper audit into a tactical manhunt. Surveillance teams were embedded around the facility's edge. They hunkered down in the woods, using thermal optics to track the gates. At 3:00 inches the morning, the compound ignited with activity. Aerial drones, cruising at 20,000 feet, detected multiple heat signatures. Vehicles were entering the site in synchronized windows, running blacked out with ground spotters for guidance. The infrared sensors revealed an even more critical detail. Giant plumes of heat were venting from the roof. The thermal signature was a blinding white on the screen. This wasn't a storage unit for crates. It was a factory running at redline. But what was the product? The link snapped into place when agents bridged the daycare's financial records. The shell companies receiving the stolen welfare checks had been placing massive orders for chemical precursors from global vendors. Acetone, ephedrine, phenylacetic acid. They weren't buying diapers or formula. They were acquiring the building blocks for industrial narcotics. The investigators saw the terrifying loop. The government funded the daycare. The daycare laundered the money. The money fueled the drug plant. And the drugs were funneled back into the very neighborhoods the welfare was meant to protect. It was a closed circuit of ruin. Ask yourself this: how can a criminal syndicate hijack billions from a federal program without triggering a single alarm? If you believe we need a total overhaul of the welfare system, hit the like button right now. At 12:21 a.m., the final command was issued: all units execute, breach, and secure. High-intensity floodlights pierced the dark as tactical squads from the FBI and DEA hit the facility's entry points. The building no longer looked like a warehouse. It was a hardened fortress. The initial breach was surgical. A focused charge blew the steel service door. As the team entered, the air wasn't just warm, it was lethal. Commanders immediately barked, masks on. The interior was choked with chemical vapors. Agents reported a metallic tang on their tongues the moment the seal was broken. The walls were lined with heavy-duty air scrubbers running at maximum power, designed to mask the chemical scent from thermal satellites. Conveyor systems were still humming. Output counters were rolling over. But in a secondary wing, the tactical teams found the human cost. In a dimly lit holding area, they discovered 58 individuals. 15 were U.S. citizens. Others were from various nations. Several had been missing for months. They were huddled on the floor, starving and broken. One man's heart rate was dangerously low. These weren't workers. They were prisoners, and they were ghosts. As agents checked them, they saw that the workers' fingertips were scarred and smooth. Their prints had been erased with acid. This was the cartel's insurance against identification. If they ever fled, or if their remains were found, they would be nameless. While medics began the extraction of the captives, the forensic teams moved to the manufacturing floor. What they found stunned even the most veteran drug units. Logs on the floor boss's desk showed chemical buys exceeding $1.2 billion in 18 months. This was a super lab. The plant was churning out 28 to 32 tons of fentanyl daily, alongside 65 tons of cocaine every week. The production line spanned 4 subterranean levels. One entry showed a single week's yield valued at over $3 billion. As the perimeter was locked down, a priority flash hit the radio. Target is mobile. Amina Farah Hassan was not at the plant. Tracking systems had picked up her car, leaving her home hours prior. Plate readers showed her moving south. Port records indicated a private vessel was set to sail before daybreak. She was making her exit. The team at the plant had killed the engine, but the brain was minutes away from reaching open water. They couldn't catch her by road. They needed the air. The chase for Amina Farah Hassan didn't end on a highway. It ended on the river. While the lab was being dismantled, a Coast Guard interceptor unit was launched toward the marina. The private cruiser, a 40-foot boat owned by a shell company, was idling ready to slip into the night. But they were too slow. The roar of rotors drowned out the engines. A federal helicopter dropped into hover, its spotlight turning the dark river into a stage. The pilot's voice boomed. "Kill the engines and prepare for boarding." On the deck, Amina Farah Hassan, the woman who converted American Charity into a cartel bank, stood paralyzed. She wasn't armed. She was holding a satellite phone, trying to verify one last wire transfer. Within seconds, agents swarmed the deck. The capture was quiet, but the phone she held was the final key. When experts cracked the device, they found the kill switch protocols. She was seconds away from a command that would have purged the entire network's servers, erasing the records of the ghost children forever. Back at headquarters, the full scale of the theft was tallied. At 10:26 a.m., federal briefings began. The numbers on the boards were staggering. The confirmed loss to the taxpayer was over $2.5 billion. That was money that never reached the vulnerable people it was meant to help. Experts calculated that over 650,000 low-income families in the state lost access to child assistance because the funds were stolen. Real daycare centers were forced to fold because they couldn't compete with a fraud ring that had zero overhead. In some sectors, licensed childcare capacity dropped by 22%. The fraud didn't just steal money, it dismantled the community's foundation. The debriefing of the cartel chemists revealed the horrifying cycle. Every cent stolen from the government was used for precursor chemicals. Those chemicals became fentanyl. That fentanyl was pushed onto the streets of the same cities where the money was taken. It was a self-feeding loop of addiction and death, funded by the victims themselves. The system hadn't been blind, it had been negligent. Approvals had become a mindless routine. In a race for efficiency, oversight was discarded. This case demands a look at the fragility of the welfare system. For years, the priority was speed, getting funds out fast. But speed killed the vetting process. The Ghost Child Network exploited the very empathy that built the system. They knew that bureaucrats were scared to challenge the status quo. They used political correctness as a shield to steal billions. The lab is dark now. The accounts are frozen. The 58 survivors are in medical care. Amina Farah Hassan and her group are facing a mountain of federal charges, including racketeering and supporting a criminal enterprise. They are looking at life behind bars. But the question remains, How many other dark buildings are collecting millions while children go hungry? The Twin Cities investigation proved that the most dangerous predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like leaders. They follow the rules, they file the forms, and they steal the future from under our noses. If you believe we need a total audit of every welfare program in the country to end this, comment accountability below. Stay vigilant.